The chieftain of Dahadijas stood on the wooden wall of a massive palisade, gazing out at the empty river valley, which concealed hundreds of invisible enemies. This day was to be the last for his people, trapped inside the fortress with no means of retreat. At stake were the fate of trade routes, control over vast territories, and the very existence of an independent culture in the region. Watch the video to the end, and you'll learn how exactly 100 defenders managed to stop an army of 800 warriors from the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. What happened next is hidden in the archives and rarely discussed outside of narrow academic circles. We're used to thinking of great empires as invincible, but real history often holds incredible surprises. This incident completely overturns the established view of the balance of power on the continent in the 17th century. It turns out that the success of the military campaign depended not on numbers, but on architectural genius and flawless strategy. Are you ready to learn the truth about the most underrated confrontation in the history of the Eastern Woods? For many decades, historians ignored this episode, favoring the more famous battles of the colonial era. However, it is precisely here that the key lies to understanding how the politics of an entire continent were shaped before the mass migration of peoples. You'll see a completely unique approach to defense that had no parallel in the traditional culture of neighboring tribes. This forgotten triumph demonstrates the incredible resilience of the human spirit in the face of an overwhelming threat. The information you're about to receive will make you take a fresh look at the strategic thinking of indigenous peoples. In this video, we'll take a detailed look at the structure of the Susquehannock people's impregnable fort and the logic behind their actions. You'll meet Chief Dahadagesa, whose diplomatic decisions proved more important than any supply of provisions. We'll analyze the tactics of the Iroquois Confederacy, whose powerful army faced an insurmountable obstacle on the path of its large-scale expansion. You will understand how geographical location and trade ties became the most reliable shield for a small community. Ahead of you lies a deep dive into a world of complex political intrigues, where every decision had long-term historical consequences. What happens when a small community decides to build a city capable of challenging the continent's most powerful empire? The Susquehannock approached the issue of security from a completely unexpected angle, abandoning traditional temporary encampments. This people erected a grand engineering structure on the riverbank that captivated the imagination of European travelers. Chief Dahadagesa personally oversaw every stage of the design, understanding the inevitability of the coming conflict. The fortress became the physical embodiment of a new defensive philosophy for the entire people. The construction site was chosen with impeccable strategic calculation. The fort was situated on a high bank of a full-flowing river, ensuring constant access to fresh water. On three sides, the settlement was protected by steep slopes and natural water barriers. This prevented the enemy from carrying out a covert encirclement or launching a sudden, large-scale attack. The geography became the besieged people's first and most reliable ally. The foundation of the defense was a powerful double palisade encircling the entire settlement. The trunks of mature trees were dug deep into the ground and fitted tightly together. The space between the two rows of logs was filled with earth and stones, creating an impenetrable wall. This structure reliably protected the inner courtyard from arrows and withstood the impact of heavy artillery. The Susquehannocks created a barrier that could not be breached without the use of sophisticated siege equipment. The most remarkable architectural feature was the corner bastions, which projected beyond the line of the main walls. These structures allowed the defenders to direct crossfire at any enemy group attempting to approach the palisade. The idea of bastions was borrowed from European traders, but brilliantly adapted to local building materials. Chief Dahadagesa quickly realized the advantage of this layout for a small garrison. A mere 100 warriors could effectively control the vast perimeter thanks to the clever distribution of positions. The fort's internal layout also followed a strict logic of survival under conditions of prolonged isolation. Traditional longhouses were arranged to provide quick access to defensive positions. Wide passageways were left between the buildings to allow for the rapid movement of reserve units. The central square served as a gathering place for council meetings and the distribution of supplies. The settlement functioned as a single, well-coordinated mechanism, ready at any moment to switch to a state of siege. Building such a structure required enormous resources and the uninterrupted work of the entire community over many months. Women and men shared the responsibilities of gathering wood and preparing the ground. Chief Haudenosaunee diplomacy secured shipments of iron tools from allies, which accelerated the construction process. Iron axes and saws made it possible to work with massive logs with unprecedented precision. This technological exchange laid the foundation for the creation of this impregnable barrier. The presence of a powerful stronghold completely transformed the tribe's social structure and way of life. The people ceased to depend on seasonal migrations, focusing instead on accumulating resources and strengthening their position. This stability allowed them to develop complex crafts and increase their food reserves in case of unforeseen circumstances. The fort became not merely a refuge, but a true political center for the entire region. Neighboring peoples began to view the Susquehannocks as the dominant force in the valley. The psychological impact of the fortress's appearance was no less important than its actual strength. Iroquois scouts, accustomed to easy victories over unfortified villages, returned with alarming reports. The high walls demoralized the enemy even before active clashes began. The defenders' confidence in their own safety was evident even through the closed gates. Architecture became a tool of diplomatic pressure, causing enemies to doubt the success of their campaign. Chief Haudenosaunee understood that the walls alone would not win the conflict without competent management. He organized a constant patrol of sentries who monitored any movements for kilometers around. Strict discipline was maintained within the community, precluding panic or unauthorized actions. Every resident, from the elders to the youngest warriors, knew exactly where to go in the event of an alarm. Order and organization became just as important a shield as the thick wooden logs. It was precisely this incredible preparation that determined the outcome of the events of 1663. A small people challenged the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, relying on intelligence and engineering. Their experience proves that the proper use of the landscape and technology can offset any numerical superiority. I'd be very interested to hear your perspective on such fortifications. What do you think about the application of European engineering solutions by the indigenous peoples of the Americas? Please share your thoughts in the comments. The Iroquois Confederacy was not a chaotic union of tribes, but a highly organized political structure. Their military campaigns were planned years in advance, guided by a strict logic of resource control. The goal of their expansion was not to seize unoccupied lands, but to monopolize the fur trade across the entire continent. To accomplish this massive undertaking, a disciplined and mobile army was required. In 1663, the Confederacy's council decided to launch a campaign to the south. An army of 800 warriors, consisting mainly of members of the Seneca Nation, set out toward the Susquehanna Valley. This was a massive force for its time, capable of wiping any typical settlement off the face of the earth. The expedition was led by experienced commanders who had dozens of successful raids under their belts. They advanced with complete confidence in their overwhelming superiority. Moving such a large force required flawless organization of supplies and navigation. The warriors traveled in small groups to avoid depleting natural resources along their route. Scouts led the way, gathering information about the condition of the trails and possible ambushes. Communication between the detachments was maintained through a system of signal flags and experienced runners. This entire machine operated in perfect unison, like a single organism focused on destroying the obstacle. The Seneca warriors' armament represented a perfect balance between tradition and new technology. Alongside their familiar bows and spears, many carried firearms obtained from Dutch traders. Muskets gave them an incredible advantage in open combat, striking terror into the hearts of their less equipped neighbors. The warriors skillfully combined volley fire with lightning-fast flanking maneuvers. This tactic brought them success throughout many years of active territorial expansion. However, their main weapon remained their impeccable reputation as invincible conquerors. Many tribes chose to surrender or abandon their lands at the first rumors of the Haudenosaunee army's approach. This psychological pressure worked flawlessly, clearing the way without a single shot being fired. The Seneca commanders counted on the fort's defenders losing their composure at the sight of 800 armed warriors. The expectation of an easy victory was firmly entrenched in the attackers' minds. The Confederacy sought to control all waterways connecting the interior territories to the ocean coast. The Susquehanna River was a key trade route along which gunpowder was delivered to European colonists. The destruction of the local population would allow the Iroquois to dictate their own prices on European markets. The economic motivation behind this campaign was far stronger than any political differences. The war was fought for complete dominance in the new economic reality of North America. As they approached the fort, Seneca scouts began to notice alarming signs. Instead of panicking people, they found empty fields and burned supplies outside the wooden walls. The Susquehannocks employed a scorched earth tactic, depriving the attackers of the ability to replenish their food supplies on the spot. This was the first indication that the enemy had no intention of surrendering without a fierce fight. The strategic plan for an easy assault began to show its first subtle cracks. The Iroquois army set up a large camp at a safe distance from the fortress walls. Hundreds of bonfires lit up the river valley, demonstrating to the besieged the immense numbers of the attackers. The Seneca commanders held a war council to discuss options for quickly breaching the palisade perimeter. Traditional siege methods were unsuitable for such an imposing architectural structure. It became necessary to adapt familiar tactics to entirely new conditions of combat. At that moment, two opposing military philosophies of the time clashed. On one side stood a powerful offensive force, accustomed to dictating its terms in open terrain. On the other stood a small group of people who had staked their hopes on a stalemate defense and engineering innovations. Tension in the valley mounted with every passing minute as preparations for the first contact were made. The outcome of this confrontation was set to forever alter the political map of the eastern forests. The Iroquois' plan seemed flawless, but they had overlooked one hidden detail in the defenders' arsenal. This miscalculation cost them everything for which this long campaign had been undertaken. What lay hidden behind those thick wooden walls, capable of turning 800 invincible warriors into a retreating mob. It turned out that the Susquehannock relied not only on sturdy logs, but also on advanced European technology. A few months before the siege, Chief de Haudenosaunee conducted a series of highly complex negotiations with representatives of the colonial administration. This diplomatic victory resulted in the delivery of several light artillery pieces. The fact that an indigenous people possessed cannons in 1663 was an absolutely unprecedented phenomenon for the entire region. Delivering the heavy metal cannons to the fortified fort was a logistical feat in itself. The cannons were transported on special boats upriver, under the strictest secrecy. The community's residents carefully hoisted the cannons onto the corner bastions, camouflaging them with branches and animal hides. To operate the artillery, the colonists provided several instructors who taught the defenders the basics of artillery. This secret training took place amid an atmosphere of extreme tension and anticipation of an imminent attack. De Haudenosaunee diplomatic talent lay in his ability to play on the contradictions among the European powers. He convinced the governor of Maryland that the fall of his fort would open a direct path for the Iroquois to the English settlements. The colonists realized that it was in their best interest to arm the Indians, rather than engage in open conflict with the Confederacy themselves. The treaty was sealed with an exchange of gifts and guarantees of mutual trade benefits. Thus, a small community became the main shield of the European colony. Installing cannons on the bastions required precise engineering calculations and structural reinforcement. The wooden platforms were reinforced with additional beams so they could withstand the powerful recoil of each shot. The firing sectors were calibrated to leave no blind spots along the approaches to the main gates. The artillery was integrated into the overall defense system, complementing the barrage of musket fire. The fort was finally transformed into an impregnable citadel, ready to face any army on the continent. The presence of the artillery was kept a closely guarded secret from the Haudenosaunee Confederacy scouts. The Iroquois were convinced that they would be storming an ordinary, albeit well-fortified, wooden settlement. The element of surprise was to be the defenders' main trump card in the upcoming battle. The chief strictly forbade any test shots until the general assault began. The silence over the fort concealed a deadly threat of which the attackers were completely unaware. The integration of cannons required the creation of a system for storing gunpowder and cannonballs within the settlement. To this end, special underground storage facilities were dug, protected from accidental sparks and moisture. The chief's most trusted associates were responsible for safeguarding the ammunition. Discipline in handling gunpowder was maintained at the level of a regular European army. Any mistake could lead to an internal explosion and the instantaneous destruction of the entire community. De Haudenosaunee personally inspected the readiness of each bastion every night leading up to the siege. He understood that 100 warriors could hold out only with perfect coordination of all actions. The defenders' morale was surprisingly high, despite the enemy's overwhelming numerical superiority. They trusted their leader and believed in the power of the new technologies obtained through his diplomacy. Fear gave way to cold determination to defend their land at any cost. The morning of the assault began with a thick fog that slowly crept through the river valley. The Seneca army began a stealthy advance toward the fort's walls, hoping to take the defenders by surprise. They moved in tight formation, confident in their ability to quickly break through the wooden gates. Hundreds of warriors approached the palisade in silence, ready to let out a battle cry. It was this very scene from the beginning of our tale that became the climax of the entire story. The fog concealed not only the attackers, but also the black muzzles of the cannons, aimed directly at the center of their formation. When the distance was reduced to a minimum, Haudenosaunee raised his hand, issuing a historic order. This moment forever divided the region's history into before and after. In the next chapter, you'll learn exactly how the events of that morning unfolded and what catastrophic consequences they brought for the attackers. No sooner had the first Seneca detachments emerged from the fog than the silence of the valley was shattered by the deafening roar of an artillery volley. The grape shot struck the attackers' dense ranks head-on, sweeping away everything in its path. For the Confederacy's warriors, who had never before faced cannons at the wooden walls, this came as a real shock. The ground shook, and thick smoke instantly blanketed the entire area in front of the bastions. The artillery barrage was followed by organized and dense musket fire. Exactly 100 defenders fired from pre-prepared positions, wasting no time reloading thanks to the assistance of the rest of the community. The fire was continuous, creating an impenetrable wall of lead in front of the palisade. Crossfire from the corner bastions left the attackers no chance to take cover. Every shot fired by the defenders hit its mark in the dense crowd of besiegers. The Haudenosaunee army, consisting of 800 experienced warriors, froze in shock for a moment. Their usual tactic of a rapid onslaught crashed against an insurmountable technological barrier. The Seneca commanders tried to restore order and send their men to storm the gates, but panic had already begun to spread. The roar of the cannons exerted incredible psychological pressure on the warriors, who were accustomed to a completely different style of combat. Their formation broke down, and their offensive momentum fizzled out in the very first minutes of the battle. Haudenosaunee stood on the wall, coolly directing the distribution of fire toward the most dangerous sections. His diplomatic triumph was now bearing its deadly fruit right on the battlefield. The defenders acted with mechanical precision, carrying out the instructions they had memorized over many months of training. They did not give in to emotion, realizing that the slightest mistake could cost them their lives. The strict discipline of the small detachment prevailed over the chaos of the massive army. The surviving Seneca commanders made the only correct decision in that situation. They signaled an immediate retreat to preserve what remained of their forces. The warriors began hastily withdrawing toward the safety of the forests, abandoning their positions in front of the fort. Any attempt to mount a proper siege was instantly abandoned due to the threat of further artillery strikes. The invincible Confederate army was forced to admit its complete defeat. The retreat took place under intense pressure from the defenders. Cannons continued to fire at the fleeing soldiers, compounding the scale of the disaster for the attackers. The Seneca warriors discarded their heavy equipment to hide more quickly behind the line of trees. Their entire camp, which had been set up the day before with such confidence, was hastily abandoned. The pride of the great empire was trampled on the rocky bank of a full-flowing river. The victory brought not only relief, but also an entirely new political status for this small nation. News of the defeat of the powerful Seneca army spread throughout all the settlements on the eastern coast. Within a matter of weeks, European colonists were convinced of the reliability of their allies and the soundness of their investments. The Confederacy's enemies received a powerful message that Iroquois expansion could be stopped. The fort became a symbol of successful resistance against an aggressive external threat. However, this battle was only the beginning of a new, even more complex historical phase. The victors understood that the empire would not forgive them for such a humiliating defeat. But how exactly were 100 people able to survive within these walls without dying of thirst and hunger? The secret, passed down from generation to generation, often lies in the proper allocation of basic resources. Withstanding a siege in a wooden fort would have been impossible without a carefully planned system of internal supply. The Susquehannock organized a self-sufficient economy right inside the palisade, preparing for months of isolation. Every square meter of protected land was used with maximum efficiency for the community's needs. The settlement's infrastructure resembled a well-oiled clockwork mechanism, with no unnecessary parts. The main problem in any siege has always been access to clean drinking water. The fort's builders anticipated this by incorporating several reliable underground springs into the defensive perimeter. Access to the river was also protected by special hidden passageways made of tightly packed logs. Women could safely fetch water, even during heavy enemy shelling. This deprived the attackers of their main weapon, the ability to wear down the fortress through thirst. Food storage was elevated to the status of a top national priority. Corn, beans, and dried meat were stored in deep pits lined with birch bark to protect them from moisture. These storage facilities were scattered throughout the fort so that a single fire would not destroy all the supplies. Access to the warehouses was strictly controlled by the Council of Elders, preventing wasteful consumption of food. Strict rationing ensured the garrison's survival, even under the most adverse circumstances. The interior was designed so that smoke from the fires would give away as few people as possible. Special dry wood was used, which produced a lot of heat but emitted virtually no thick smoke. The fire pits were located in deep recesses inside the long houses, retaining heat during the cold nights. This technique allowed the defenders to cook food and keep warm without revealing their activity to enemy patrols. The ability to control even such minor details demonstrates the community's exceptionally high level of preparedness. Medical care was another pillar of this small garrison's resilience. Healers had prepared hundreds of bundles of medicinal herbs, roots, and bark in advance to treat wounds and illnesses. Inside the fort, a special spacious house was set aside to serve as a field hospital. Clean bandages and boiled water were always on hand in case of a sudden enemy attack. Timely medical care allowed wounded soldiers to return to duty quickly. Maintaining sanitary standards in such crowded conditions was no less important. To this end, special drainage systems were set up to carry waste far beyond the living quarters. Ash from campfires was used to disinfect and neutralize unpleasant odors within the perimeter. Strict discipline regarding hygiene prevented the outbreak of internal epidemics during the siege. Cleanliness became just as essential to survival as the thickness of the wooden walls. Chief Dahadages understood that prolonged inactivity could undermine discipline more quickly than enemy arrows. Therefore, he constantly organized training exercises, weapon inspections, and the assignment of new duties. Life inside the fort was governed by a strict schedule that left no time for despondency or panic. The routine calmed the people, creating an illusion of normality in utterly abnormal conditions. The psychological defenses were built just as skillfully as the physical bastions. Flawless logistics became the invisible foundation upon which this incredible victory was built. The organization of daily life proved that intelligence is capable of prevailing even in the most extreme situations. What will happen when this powerful internal machine confronts the geopolitical consequences of its triumph? The Susquehannock victory in 1663 did not merely save a single fort, it completely redrew the map of geopolitical influence. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy's powerful expansion southward was abruptly and irrevocably halted. The river valley became an impenetrable buffer, protecting the southern colonies and tribes from invasion. This status quo persisted for more than a decade, providing unprecedented stability in a turbulent region. Realizing that it was impossible to break through the Haudenosaunee defenses, the Confederation's leaders were forced to rethink their overall strategy. They abandoned their attempts to seize the southern trade routes and redirected their military efforts far to the west. This decision saved many small peoples of the eastern coast from inevitable absorption or annihilation. The course of a vast empire's development was altered by the resistance of exactly 100 defenders of a wooden fort. A single morning completely changed the fates of dozens of communities across a vast territory. Maryland and the other southern colonies gained a vital respite for their own development. The absence of a threat from the north allowed them to fortify their settlements and expand their farmland. Trade with the Susquehannocks flourished, bringing enormous profits to both sides of this mutually beneficial alliance. The Europeans continued to supply the fort with weapons, recognizing its key role in ensuring overall security. The region's economy began to grow rapidly thanks to the establishment of secure borders. The Susquehannock monopolized trade between the interior territories and the European ports on the coast. They dictated their own terms for exchanging furs for iron tools and firearms. The economic power of this small people reached unprecedented heights during these peaceful years. Cultural exchange within the fort fostered the emergence of unique craft traditions. Artisans combined ancient techniques for working bone and wood with the use of European iron. Tableware, jewelry, and clothing items created during this period were distinguished by their incredible elegance. The women of the community developed new farming methods that ensured stable harvests near the fort's protected perimeter. People's daily lives became more comfortable and predictable, despite the harsh laws of the time. The security system was constantly being improved to account for the possibility of new, more sophisticated attacks. Watchtowers were raised even higher, and the patrol perimeter was expanded by several kilometers. The community invested part of its trade revenues in purchasing additional gunpowder and reinforcing the bastions. People understood that peace in the 17th century was merely a temporary lull between conflicts. Maintaining combat readiness remained the primary task of every resident of this independent enclave. The history of Haudenosaunee and its people during this period is a classic example of successful survival. They managed to create an oasis of stability at the very center of a raging geopolitical storm. Their diplomacy and military infrastructure functioned flawlessly throughout an entire historical decade. They proved that a small nation can dictate its will to large empires with the right approach. This lesson in political flexibility deserves detailed study and respect. However, the long years of calm also harbored hidden threats associated with complete political isolation. The balance of power in the region was poised for a new, inevitable upheaval that would change the fate of the continent. In the next chapter, you'll learn what hidden processes began to undermine this alliance from within. Are you ready to see the flip side of this incredible historical triumph? After repelling the Seneca Armada's attack, a truly unique period of cultural revival began inside the fort. The sense of complete security, provided by the thick walls and cannons, unleashed the creative energy of this small people. People no longer lived in constant fear of sudden nighttime raids or the loss of their supplies. This peace of mind led to the creation of remarkable works of art and complex social rituals. The community's artisans reached unprecedented heights in working with both traditional and new materials. Intricate bone and wood carvings now adorned not only ritual objects, but also everyday utensils. Artisans began actively using copper elements obtained through trade to create intricate ornamentation. The Susquehannock pottery of this period is distinguished by its incredible durability and rich geometric patterns. These artifacts still amaze archaeologists with their exceptional technical quality. The appearance of the inhabitants of the impregnable wooden fort on the river also changed. An abundance of furs and European fabrics made it possible to create complex, layered clothing for the cold seasons. Women adorned their outfits with glass beads, which became the primary symbol of status and wealth. Warriors wore elements of armor, combining thick leather with copper plates for additional protection. The people's appearance conveyed confidence, wealth, and a readiness to defend their achievements. During this period, a complex system of internal governance and knowledge transfer was consolidated. Elders were able to meet regularly to discuss laws and preserve oral historical traditions. Young people underwent extensive training not only in the art of hunting, but also in the intricacies of diplomatic negotiations. The fort became a kind of academy where a new generation of educated political leaders was nurtured. Haudenosaunee personally ensured that the experience of successful defense was passed on to young warriors. Agriculture reached a new level, thanks to stability and the use of iron tools. Vast fields of corn, beans, and squash stretched out around the fort, yielding bountiful harvests every fall. The surplus food allowed the community to hold lavish celebrations and invite representatives from allied tribes. These feasts served not only as entertainment, but also to strengthen important political ties in the region. Food became as much a diplomatic tool as furs or iron axes. An economy based on trade required a constant influx of new goods from neighbors. When the fur trade in the nearby forests began to dwindle, the community faced its first hidden crises. They had to send hunting parties farther and farther afield, risking encounters with bands of vengeful Iroquois. Maintaining the trade monopoly at its previous high level began to require greater effort. The Golden Age was slowly but surely approaching its inevitable historical decline. This cultural phenomenon proves that security is the primary condition for the development of any society. As soon as the threat of physical annihilation disappears, human intellect turns to creation and the enrichment of daily life. The Susquehannock set an example of how quickly an indigenous people can adapt new technologies to enrich their culture. Their achievements during these peaceful years were no less great than their legendary military victory. Unfortunately, history rarely allows such enclaves to exist forever. The looming disaster did not come from the north, where it had been expected for many years. The most terrifying threat turned out to be invisible, silent, and utterly deadly to all the inhabitants of the fort. What happened when isolation ceased to be a protection and turned into a deadly trap? The main enemy of the inhabitants of the impregnable fort turned out to be not armed men, but invisible microorganisms. European traders, who brought weapons and iron tools, unwittingly brought new diseases with them as well. Infections to which the colonists had long since developed immunity proved fatal to the indigenous population. Deadly viruses penetrated the thick walls unhindered, paying no heed to the wooden bastions and cannons. The crowded conditions within the fortified settlement facilitated the rapid spread of any disease. What had been an advantage in defending against an army became a major disadvantage during an epidemic. The disease spread from house to house at an alarming rate, striking entire families within a matter of days. Traditional medicine practiced by healers, so effective in treating wounds, proved utterly powerless against the new viruses. Panic began to quietly spread through the once confident and prosperous community. The first victims were the most respected and wise members of society, the elders. The loss of the elders meant not only the death of people, but also the loss of a vast body of oral knowledge. Along with them went the secrets of the crafts, the details of historical treaties, and the subtleties of diplomatic etiquette. The community was rapidly losing its intellectual foundation, which had been built over decades of painstaking labor. It was a blow to the very cultural identity of the invincible Susquehannock people. The elders were followed by experienced warriors, who formed the backbone of the fort's defense. Physically strong men were burning up with fever, depriving the fortress of its main resource, its defenders. The number of men capable of wielding a musket or operating the artillery dwindled steadily with each passing month. Haudenosaunee watched in horror as his invincible army of 100 men melted away before his eyes. The strategic advantage, built on discipline and training, vanished along with the lives being lost. The epidemic also destroyed the complex system of internal self-sufficiency, described in previous chapters. There was no one left to hunt, gather firewood, or maintain cleanliness throughout the vast settlement. The cornfields were overrun with weeds, as the women lacked the strength to perform agricultural work. The well-established mechanism for self-sufficient survival suffered a critical breakdown under the weight of the biological catastrophe. Famine began to threaten the few who had managed to survive the first waves of the deadly disease. The psychological blow from the epidemic was no less devastating than the physical losses. People who had grown accustomed to considering themselves the invincible masters of the valley suddenly realized their absolute vulnerability. Religious rituals offered no solace, sowing doubts about the correctness of the chosen path and the favor of the spirits. Depression and despair became constant companions for those who still found the strength to wake up in the morning. The proud spirit of the defenders was broken not by steel weapons, but by an invisible force of nature. This tragic chapter in history demonstrates the fragility of human achievements in the face of biological threats. Any ideal strategy can be undermined by factors that are impossible to foresee or control. The decline of the Susquehannocks began precisely at the moment they reached the height of their power. Their impregnable walls became, for many of them, a beautiful but merciless wooden tomb. History once again proved its unpredictability and cruelty toward the victors. Weakened by disease, the fort was a tempting prize for those who had long dreamed of controlling the valley. Once the enemy within had done its work, men with weapons took the stage once more. How did former allies exploit this horrific tragedy for their own political gain? By 1675, the demographic situation in the European colonies had changed dramatically due to the arrival of new settlers. The new colonists needed open land, and the old treaties with the indigenous peoples had become a serious obstacle. Weakened by epidemics, the Susquehannock fort was no longer viewed as a reliable ally or a useful buffer. The policies of Maryland and Virginia shifted sharply from cooperation to outright aggression. Minor border skirmishes, to which the Susquehannock had no connection, served as a pretext for the attack. Militias under the command of ambitious colonial officers decided to exploit the situation to seize the strategic valley. A combined force of several hundred armed colonists approached the walls of the wooden fortress. They demanded the surrender of the chiefs and complete submission, threatening to use force against the weakened garrison. Yesterday's suppliers of artillery had turned into ruthless and cynical conquerors. Haudenosaunee, realizing the impossibility of a prolonged siege by a handful of warriors exhausted by disease, chose the path of diplomacy. He believed that logic, Old agreements and common sense could stop the senseless bloodshed. Accompanied by the four most respected elders, he stepped outside the fort's gates under the banner of peace negotiations. They carried with them historical documents and medals confirming their status as allies of the English crown. It was a gesture of incredible courage and faith in the power of the law. However, the colonial militia had no intention of conducting fair negotiations with a weakened enemy. As soon as the chiefs arrived at their camp, they were treacherously captured and accused of crimes that never occurred. Without trial or investigation, and in defiance of all the rules of war, the officers ordered the negotiators to be executed. Haudenosaunee, the architect of the greatest victory over the Iroquois Empire, fell at the hands of those he had defended. This betrayal shocked not only the indigenous peoples, but also some honest European observers. The chief's death marked the final chapter in the history of this unique settlement's resistance. Deprived of their wisest leader, the remnants of the community realized that it was pointless to expect justice from the Europeans. That very night, using their secret river exits, the survivors left their native fort forever. They departed quietly, leaving the colonists with nothing but empty longhouses and the cold ashes of their hearths. The impregnable fortress fell to the enemy without a single shot being fired from its famous cannons. The events at the fort's walls caused a stir, even in distant London, where the militiamen's actions were condemned. The colony's governor attempted to punish the officers responsible for their high-handedness and the murder of allied chiefs. However, this could no longer bring Haudenosaunee back to life or restore the destroyed community. The Europeans' political apologies seemed pitiful given the scale of their betrayal. History once again revealed its ruthless cynicism. The abandoned fort soon fell into disrepair and was destroyed by time and looters. The wooden walls rotted away, and the metal cannons were carried off by the valley's new masters. The place where the fate of an entire continent was decided became overgrown with dense forest and tall grass. Nature quickly erased the traces of engineering genius, leaving only artifacts hidden underground. The physical disappearance of the fortress was a prelude to its disappearance from historical memory. How did such significant events end up on the margins of official historiography? Why aren't the names of the heroes of this battle studied in schools alongside those of other military leaders? In the final chapter, we will examine the phenomenon of historical amnesia and summarize this incredible journey. Our conclusions will shed light on the hidden facts of the past. History, as we know, is written by the victors, and in the long run, the Susquehannock did not become victors. The European colonists who built their settlements on these lands did not want to recall the betrayal of 1675. They were uncomfortable acknowledging that their safety had long depended on the indigenous people. Therefore, references to Haudenosaunee and his impregnable fort were systematically removed from popular chronicles. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy was also not interested in preserving the memory of this local conflict. The defeat of an army of 800 warriors at the hands of a small handful of defenders was too painful a blow to their pride. In their mighty oral epic, preference was given to great victories and successful conquests of new territories. Thus, through the joint efforts of former allies and former enemies, this episode was erased from collective memory. An information vacuum quickly engulfed one of the most remarkable battles of the 17th century. However, documents and archaeological finds are not subject to emotion or political censorship. Excavations in the Susquehannock Valley confirmed every word of the rare reports by colonial officials. Historians have found traces of those very double walls, underground storage facilities, and the remains of artillery positions. These silent witnesses have restored justice by proving the highest level of engineering ingenuity among indigenous peoples. Science has restored our right to admire the genius of these forgotten architects and strategists. Chief Haudenosaunee path is a unique example of leadership in a time of historical crisis. He did not merely react to threats. He anticipated them and built the infrastructure to repel them. His decision to combine traditional knowledge with European technology saved hundreds of lives at a critical moment. He became a symbol of intellectual resistance, proving that wars are won through intelligence, not merely by sheer numbers. His tragic end does not diminish the greatness of his achievements during the fort's heyday. The history of this fort completely shatters primitive stereotypes about the lives of Native Americans before the arrival of the colonists. They were not passive victims of circumstance or savage tribes with no understanding of geopolitics. They were complex societies capable of engaging in subtle diplomatic maneuvers and constructing large-scale defensive structures. They knew how to analyze the balance of power and make unconventional decisions at the state level. This fort stands as proof of their outstanding intellect and political maturity. The emotional ups and downs of this story reveal the inherent instability of human existence in any era. A triumphant victory over a massive army was followed by a period of cultural flourishing and prosperity. This was followed by the quiet horror of an invisible epidemic and, finally, a bitter betrayal by business partners. This scenario encompassed the entire spectrum of human experience, from absolute grandeur to utter despair. Such is the real, unvarnished story of life on the frontier of civilizations. As we recreate this world, we see not just dry dates, but living people with their hopes and fears. We see women casting bullets, elders distributing supplies, and warriors standing their ground to the death in the fog. Their resourcefulness, discipline, and faith in their leader are worthy of admiration even centuries later. They left behind a lesson on how to face insurmountable difficulties with their heads held high. Their legacy is a hymn to the indomitable human spirit. In summary, we can say with confidence that this people fulfilled their historic mission. They proved that even a small group of people is capable of stopping a massive war machine. What other forgotten historical episodes do you think deserve a detailed analysis on our channel? Be sure to suggest your own topics in the comments below this video, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel.